I'm really delighted that you came out to join us this morning for a very special program indeed. My name is John Holden. I'm the president of the Edgewater Historical Society. Can I just ask, is this the first lecture for any of you here today? Oh, great. Okay. Well, it's nice to see a bunch of newbies. Also, if you're not a member of the Edgewater Historical Society, I would encourage you to join for the wonderful introductory rate of $5 for the first year. We have membership brochures at the back table. You get a lot of great benefits from being a member. Most notably is our wonderful quarterly newsletter that's put together 4 times a year by our past president, Kathy Gemperle, our founder and past president, I should say. We'll have another program on Tuesday, December 6th, featuring me and Kathy, hopefully, on the Edgewater Beach Hotel, which we wrote a book a year ago. Our lecture series was a little bit interrupted by COVID, so we're looking to come back and just present a few more opportunities, but it's a great story, a lot of fun for the holidays, and we'll have books for sale if you're hard up for holiday gift ideas this year. Without too much further ado, I want to introduce my immediate past president of the Edgewater Historical Society, Bob Reamer. Bob's got very deep roots in the community indeed. He was deeply involved with the Edgewater Community Council. Can I just see a quick show of hands? How many people in the room here were involved with the ECC back in the day? All right. Well, we got a good representation here. Bob not only did a lot of great work with the ECC, but he also had a big role in Jack's involvement in the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
And I want to thank, I'm so happy to have John Holden succeed. Anyway, yeah, I'm happy to be in a new role. I'm an elder now. And you know what? I don't have anything to do except to introduce my dear, wonderful, my young friend over there. I can't believe it. He's retired. When I met him, he was this youngster. Anyway, I'm going to tell you about Jack. He's been a tremendous asset for Edgewater. Many of you know him. He was head of the Operation Winter Kenmore for the Edgewater Community Council. He became executive director of the Edgewater Community Council. He then went on for, what was that kind of funny job called Housing Commissioner for the City of Chicago. Did great things there, working in affordable housing, and then he went off to head, the CIC, is that the official? Yep. Which is a non-for-profit, it's like a bank, sort of. I mean, they raise money and invest in non-profit housing and smaller developments. And he has a very, very distinguished career. But he got started here at Edgewater, and that's why I'm so proud of my young friend. He's going to talk about what happened with Operation Kenmore Winter. Well, what preceded it was this book called Reversing Urban Decline. It was written by an Edgewater resident, Ed Marstiniak, who had been a prominent city official, a Loyola professor, and he wrote this about all the difficulties that Edgewater was going through to eventually come together and say, hey, we got to do something. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit, because there's so many moving parts in Edgewater, and I know we've got, I don't get political, but we've got all the Manic campaign coming up, and it's a chance for Edgewater to kind of look back and see what were all those moving parts, what makes Edgewater work, what are the important aspects, and this is one part of it, to look about what we did in the community to bring Edgewater to what it is today, because it was not that way back in 1970, or that way in 1980. And I see in this room a lot of people who played important roles in making that all come together. Jack, I first met him, he and Ed Marstiniak and I interviewed this young graduate of a planning program in Oregon at the Awful Waffle. Anybody remember the Awful Waffle? Yeah. Where Walgreens is now. And we were so impressed, we said, we gotta hire this guy. So we hired him and to head up Operation Winter Kenmore. And Edgewater at the time, how many of you here were living in Edgewater in the 70s? Oh, you know what? You know. Okay. For those of you, I don't need this, but for the others, you got to remember, the Edgewater of today was not the Edgewater of 1978 or 1980. Like many urban communities in post-war time, we had a lot of issues going on. We were plagued by the dumping of, I hate this word, the dumping of institutionalized citizens. We had a lot of halfway houses, we had a couple of detox centers, a lot of this all along Kenmore and Winthrop. And plus we had a lot of other urban ills, arson, slumlords. I moved into Kenmore and Winthrop, you know what, I couldn't afford to buy my place now, but I certainly could back in 1979. So a lot of this changed. We were suffering tremendous, incredible political corruption, voter fraud, and some of us who are here in the room, we know what voter fraud was. And a lot of that has been changed by the system. But again, we had political leadership up until the mid-70s that was just so corrupt. I mean, I could go on and on and on. We got a whole lecture series about the corruption, the political corruption, and how Edgewater got its groove, how Edgewater got its political independence. The key turning point, I think, was the election of Marion Kennedy Bellini as an independent alderperson in Edgewater. He's in the back, right? Raise your hand, young man. Another guy retired. I can't believe it. When he was 16, he was appointed the youngest precinct captain in the Cook County Democratic Party back in 1982. Now look at this guy. He's retired with grown kids. Anyway, you don't want to listen to me talk about getting old. Anyway, a lot was happening. Block clubs were being formed to try and fight some of these urban ills. Leroy Blumert is out in the back. He and Mark became wall-to-wall block clubs, and that became a major defense against urban decay. There was a lot of activism, and Leroy, you and Marge have never been properly acknowledged, but we really need to acknowledge that. Edgewater was getting an identity. Hey, we were part of Uptown. What do you mean, Edgewater? Well, what happened was we got lumped together with Uptown in the city maps. This is back in the day when we were victims of top-down community planning. What is a community? You guys don't know about planning. What do you know about what you want? Well, they told us, no, you're part of Uptown. Some sociologists at the University of Chicago drew these maps and said they knew all about communities and so on. But Uptown and Edgewater had distinctly different histories. Well, Leroy Blumert, again, came to the rescue. He did a lot of research to make the argument that, no, Edgewater is distinctly different with a different history than many other people. And eventually, we made the case that Edgewater needs to be its own planning unit. Well, other things are happening. Safety Watch, the Edgewater Community Council, they organized safety patrols. People go out on weekends and fight, look for crime. Or fighting slumlords. Fighting new high-rises in Sharon Road. Edgewater was getting its act together. But what do we do with all this energy and all these moving parts? Well, we focused on the idea that where are the biggest problems? Kenmore and Winthrop. So we realized, with the help of Loyola University, by the way, and I would give them props and credit, we got funding for a planning grant. And Edgewater, this is really interesting because I think it's very historic. Edgewater was the first independent community to get a planning grant from the city of Chicago. Can you believe that? They didn't believe that people in the neighborhoods could do their own planning and plan their own destiny. Can you believe that? I mean, we accept it now, yeah, the community just gets to do its own planning. But back then, the wisdom was, oh, you people don't know how to plan. Well, we have people going to planning school, they know what they're doing, and the community knew where we wanted to go. So anyway, I'm going on and on. A lot of stuff was happening. Kenmore Winthrop became the focus. And Edgewater, interestingly enough, took the bold move to support subsidized housing. Wait a minute, aren't we fighting halfway houses? Aren't we fighting all these nursing homes and all these detox centers? We want more poor people? No. Well, that wasn't what we wanted. It wasn't that we wanted. It wasn't an issue of that. It was an issue of improving the housing for the people that live there. So we took the bold step with a lot of opposition to support what we called the Pines of Edgewater, which was a dozen, I thought it was 20 buildings, but I reread the book, it was like 13. Rehab, the company Fuel and Habitat came in and rehabbed all these buildings for Section 8 housing, seniors and families. It was very successful. So what do? Two things happened. Edgewater got its identity. We were the first community to get delegated planning. And then we hired Jack Markowski. With that, after my lengthy introduction, my dear young friend.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to everybody here. You know, what Bob speaks about, I'm going to talk a lot about housing and what we did on housing, because that's what we were focusing on Winthrop and Kenmore. But I also, in my presentation, I want to extend it to the larger community as well and relate this to community organization, what we were doing. Everything we did on Winthrop and Kenmore, it was a primary focus of broad community activism and community organization. And it's so important that all of it was embedded in that and came out of that. And I'm going to come back at the end of this to talk about how I think we should reflect on that today. And I think it's something that's needed today, that we don't have the same kind of depth and strength of community organization and activism, and what came out of that and how productive that was. So, but Bob, so many people like him, and I'm not going to name all the names, but so many people were at the Edgewater Community Council and in different parts of the community, working on different projects, complementing each other, and it all went together. He mentioned Leroy, and I want to mention Leroy as well. You know, Leroy, where's your book, Bob? This Reversing Urban Decline. Leroy, he was noted, Leroy Blomert, he was the hero of this book, Reversing Urban Decline, because he was the guy. I mean, it's a funny thing. In the 1970s, to like a community accomplishment is to get an identity for your community, get identified and recognized as community area number 77. If you ever think about, if you look at a map of the city of Chicago and you look at all these community areas and you watch them being numbered 1, 2, 3, all. And it goes 1, 2, 77, 3, 4, 5, and it goes the rest of them. Where did that come from? And it came from that what's now Community Area 77, Edgewater, was part of Community Area 3, which is uptown there, and there were 76 communities, and Edgewater got recognized as number 77. And that's important. It's a funny thing, but that image of the community was very important in our efforts and what we did. So, and that was all a foundation of Leroy, the Edgewater Community Council, Bob, Kathy Gemperle is here, everybody who worked on that kind of thing in the 70s. So let's get started on this. I'm going to talk about this focus. By the way, another thing that was unusual with the Edgewater Community Council, at least that I thought when I came there, when I got hired, was Bob and the council and Ed Marciniak had this vision that, you know, what is a community organization? So many times, are you just fighting the high-rise on that's proposed for Sheridan Road? Are you just, are you reactive? Let's put it that way. Are you reacting to what you see as problems? Is it possible to bring people together in a proactive way to identify something that we all want to work on as a goal for the community? And that was an effort, that's what the community did, and said, we want to focus on this 12-block stretch from Foster to Devon on Winthrop and Kenmore. That's the spine of the community. That's the focus of what we called issues, problems. And we see as we have to deal with that. That affects the whole community. And and they were able to get people on Sheridan Road and condo associations, west of Broadway and block clubs, the institutions in the area, all supported this. as a proactive effort of something to deal with. And I think that's interesting from a community organization perspective, that you weren't just fighting problems, fighting issues, you were actually developing and moving in a proactive way. So that's what as Bob said, I was a graduate, moved back to planning school, came back to the city of Chicago. I was looking for a job. I thought originally when I came back and got hired, I thought, all right, I'm gonna do this study they want to do of housing conditions on Winthrop and Kenmore. I'll develop some plan for what we're going to do about it, and then that'll take me 6 months, and after that I'll have something under my belt here in Chicago, and I'll go out and get a real job. But as it so happened, one thing led to another, and I ended up staying there for 10 years and carrying out the recommendations of the study. This is what was produced at the time, Edgewater in the 80s, a planning perspective for Edgewater's neighborhood strategy area. At any rate, and that's what we implemented the recommendations there for the next 10 years. So to get started here, I'm going to go through a few things. I want to go quickly. I want to go through a lot of people. John Holden told me as he was asking me to present here, a lot of people just look at this today, have no idea about the background of where this all came from, how this community developed, and we just see what's there today. So I'm going to run through. It's kind of a dense presentation, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to run through quickly some historical perspective on how the community developed, Edgewater developed, and then come through to what conditions were like in 1980 and what our strategy was and what resulted from that. So here we go. So this is timeline for development of East Edgewater. You see it all today, everybody. And what I want to say, originally this was part of East Edgewater, Winthrop and Kenmore from Foster to Bryn Mawr, was actually the first developed part of Edgewater back in 1885. Single families and 2 flats. It was the first section of Edgewater to be developed. So that's what we had. In 1908, there was a train that came up there, but in 1908, the L was extended to Howard Street from Bryn Mawr. And in the 1910s and 20s, we saw increasing density. There was more commercial development, multifamily, mid-rise, apartment hotels. The Edgewater Beach Hotel, built in 1916. Remember, it was first single families and 2 flats. We had a slowing of development in the 30s and 40s with the Depression and World War II. That's when the official community maps came out and Edgewater was recognized as part of Uptown, considered part of Uptown. In the 1950s, we had an extension of Lakeshore Drive that was extended. People talk about the next mile. And Lakeshore Drive incrementally extended up the lakefront, and parks would come with it. And unfortunately, the other side of it is traffic would come with it. And that's society-wise, we kind of lost our impetus for extending Lakeshore Drive at some point. The last it was extended, it ended right in the middle of our community on Hollywood there. And that happened in the 50s, but it brought with it parks, beaches, traffic. Also during that time, this was post-World War II, the big housing demand with soldiers coming back from the war, not a lot of development to start with. And so we had a lot of cut-up apartments. A lot of these 6 flats, particularly, that were there were cut up. Some of them would have like 30 units in them, cut up into little studio apartments. In the 1960s, the 4+1s came, and I'll talk to you about what the 4+1s were. And the Sheridan Road high-rises also began to be developed in the 60s. And by the 70s, there was deterioration, poor management, abandonment, arson, demolition, a big racial change going on in Winthrop and Kenmore, and there was a creation of the Edgewater Community Council. And in 1980, Edgewater was recognized as Community Area 77. One of the themes here is this density. I want to point out these big occurrences that happen. You start out as single families and 2 flats, and then you get multifamily, and then you get more, you get the common corridor buildings, you have 4+1s, you have the cut-up apartments, and all of it is increasing density of the area, and that becomes, it's an interesting thing. Why does the density increase? It increases because of, we had good access to transportation, good transit access, and we were well located, we were a desirable community. But I would say, kind of overdid it overall. There was no check on all of this. It just density, 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 and that becomes a huge issue here. I think density is good, and it's important for a community and can be used to good effect, but it can also be overdone, and I think you'll see what we had here. So this is the original developments. This is took some pictures on Winthrop in the original development area. Single families. Whoops. Let me go backwards. 2 flats. That was what originally, there was a little bit of commercial development on Bryn Mawr originally, but public transit brought commercial development and increasing density. In the 10s and 20s, we had more multifamily then. All these pictures are on Winthrop and Kenmore, by the way. That's what it started to be. Then also in the 10s and 20s, this is when these common corridor buildings came, and this is going to be a big theme of the common corridor buildings, the increasing density, and what was in these buildings, and who did they cater to, and what did they become? They became, you will see, a central part of the issues, the problems on Winthrop and Kenmore. Like I say, common corridor, we called them common corridor. Sometimes, today there's the terminology SRO, single room occupancy. It's an overlapping kind of categorization. But I just drew a quick floor plan. The common corridor building looked like this. It was, that's an overhead shot of the floor plan. And you'll see it had a bunch of studio apartments, maybe 1 bedrooms at the front and back, with 1 corridor down the middle. These were 4 to 8 story buildings. Would have maybe 50 to 100 units in them. I said primarily studios. So they catered, at the time they were built, these common corridor buildings. Think about this, they were built in the 1910s and 20s. I said there was the extension of public transit at the time, and Edgewater was kind of a hip singles area at that with the commercial development. They catered to young singles. Women were coming into the workforce. A lot of people coming in from the countryside, coming to work in the city. They lived in these common corridor buildings. They had great transportation, a vibrant commercial district, primarily on Bryn Mawr, and all these modern amenities like elevators, maid or linen service, switchboards, food service. So these were for hip singles that in the workforce who moved into the common corridor buildings. And there were a lot of them. And also at that time, the Edgewater Beach Hotel was built there, but there became the apartment hotels in general. That's just a picture of the Edgewater Beach Hotel. You're right about that. Sorry, that's the apartments that used to be connected to the hotel on the other end, or associated with. But the hotel was built in 1916. In 1950s, we had the extension of Lakeshore Drive. This is another big development impact for the community. I mean, all of a sudden there were good things, as I said, parks and beaches coming. And I guess you could say, we all enjoy, I think, good traffic access to the loop from the drive. But this at Hollywood here, this is like 100,000 cars a day, dumps into the middle of the community, and that's something the community hasn't been able to deal with to this day, I don't think. Parks, beaches, high-rise, traffic. There it is. And you see on Hollywood, particularly in Winthrop and Kenmore, we have this Hollywood, you have big traffic on Sheridan Road, but then you have Hollywood and going up Ridge. Ridge was totally transformed from a diagonal street that was of reasonable size to being a throughway that's and Hollywood bisects Winthrop and Kenmore. More high rises. This became, as Bob said, this became an issue in the neighborhood of fighting high rises that on enough is enough on the lakefront. That at one point Edgewater Community Council and the community decided no more high rises, and they were able to police that pretty well. But there were still many, and a lot of the open space ended up getting turned into parks, say. But we had gone a long way with many high rises already to define the area. And by the way, there is difference of opinion on that. Some people thought the high rises were, I mean, we know you could talk about the negatives and the wall of against the cutting off the community from the lake. But you also could say there was lots of relatively modestly priced condominiums moderately priced, I'd say, condominiums on Sheridan Road that provide particularly, well, lots of seniors particularly live there. In the 60s and 70s, here came another density development, 4+1s. Now the 4+1s, they ended up replacing many of the, what used to be, so it's funny when you look at this area and you see how densely developed it is, and it wasn't always like that. So there were 1 to 6 unit buildings that were here where these 4+1s were, and 4+1s would have 50 to 100 units in them. For the name 4+1 just relates to the 4 stories, 1, 2, 3, 4, above a parking garage. And that's, so that happened, that was a big development in the 60s and 70s as they came through the area. Again, they came because there was a desirability in the area. People wanted to live here. But again, it kind of overdid it. So replaced 1 to 6 unit buildings with 50 to 100 unit buildings, primarily 1-bedroom apartments, another significant increase in density and transiency. And I say transiency because what we're getting is the whole area is being transformed into one that is dominated by studio and 1-bedroom apartments, rental apartments, predominantly rental, and the owner occupancy portion is just down, down, down. There's not a base of owner occupants, or there is a base, but it gets increasingly small. So these 4+1s they were modern. The funny thing about them, some people again liked them because they were modern. They had off-street parking. That was a good thing. Parking's always an issue. Were they good options for affordable housing? They were modestly priced. Some people called them human parking garages. And I said it was a funny term. That terminology, what that meant was somebody thought that developers were like just keeping them like as parking garages, like you would downtown as an interim use, and eventually there would be some dramatic upscale development there. And nothing like that has ever happened, and it won't happen as far as I can tell, because frankly, they're worth too much the way they are now. When you have 50 to 100 units sitting, and they can be rented, they're desirable in the marketplace, and people rent them. They're not going to be torn down and moved into some upscale development. There is no such thing. There they are. There's some more 4+1s. There's a lot of them now. So here we have the conditions on Winthrop and Kenmore in 1980. When I arrived in 81. The density, there were 10,000 dwelling units on Winthrop and Kenmore. Is 8 times the city average. And I just want to emphasize, this is a really dense area. It's a dense area with lots of studios and 1-bedrooms, lots of rental housing. 2/3 of these units were in 4+1s or common corridor buildings and apartment hotels. So they dominated the area. Absentee ownership, 95% rental housing on Winthrop and Kenmore. Predominantly studio and 1-bedroom. And at this time, in 1980, the obsolete housing stock. So this is 4+1s, there might be a problem, but they weren't really obsolete. The common corridor buildings were where the obsolescence was. These buildings built in the 10s and 20s had lost desirability. That used to think it was great to have an elevator, great to have a maid, linen service, switchboards. All of that had gone away by this time. And instead, they were just these tiny little apartments that had very little demand in the general marketplace. As a result, they ended up getting used for lots of what we called institutional uses. So they became, Bob said that, he was right, they became very popular for these psychiatric halfway houses. And all of a sudden, it was funny, it corresponded with advocacy for deinstitutionalization of mental patients in the mental institutions. So let's say that's a good thing. And this often happened on Winthrop and Kenmore. Something that would be like a good thing in a bigger, broader picture ended up not being a good thing when it gets carried out in a concentrated area on Winthrop and Kenmore. So you have these guys, you had struggling apartment building owners and these common corridor buildings that couldn't rent their units. You had people, the state wanted to deinstitutionalize mental patients, move them into community settings, and overnight, all of these landlords that used to be like low-end landlords anyway running these buildings, they become keepers, proprietors of psychiatric halfway houses. Some of them were even dispensing drugs and so forth, but to their residents. But there were things, as Bob said, like there was a detox center, various kinds of rehab homes, transient rooming houses. So, and I will tell you, it was funny because one of the things, we'll get to it, we declared a moratorium on institutional uses on Winthrop and Kenmore. And it was so funny that time after time, there'd be something that would be a socially good thing, you'd think. It sounded good, but it wasn't good when you said you got to be like psychiatric patients better in the community. Well, it's not really in the community if you put them into a place where that's where everything else is, too, and it's all concentrated there. So it was difficult to enforce that, but we were effective in that. I said cut up apartment buildings, and there was a lot of, these were primarily like the six flats. Again, suffering from lack of demand, they just, instead of renting out a nice apartment in a six flat, cut it up into individual units. Might have 25 or 30 units in it, in what used to be a six flat. A lot of demolition and abandonment. At the time when we started in 1981, there were 21 parcels of vacant land and 16 empty boarded up buildings. Again, almost all of them had been primarily common corridor buildings before they were vacant and before, right. And, so that had happened, all that demolition and abandonment happened during the 70s. And from 1970 to 1980, the only new construction in the area had been basically publicly assisted housing. There was, for instance, you'll see, if any of you are familiar with that, these are a couple sites of CHA scattered site housing, which happened was constructed in the 1970s. And this is on, one of them's on Kenmore and one of them's on Winthrop there. But it's funny because, again, this was ironic that CHA had an order under what was called the Gautreaux order to do scattered site housing, and that was supposed to build housing in in a lot of parts of the city, including what they call general areas. And general areas were predominantly white areas, and Edgewater got classified as that. But when you build the scattered site housing in Edgewater, you're not building it in a predominantly white area. They ended up building it on Winthrop and Kenmore. And so, again, this was just an example of the way that Winthrop and Kenmore ended up being kind of the butt end of a lot of socially sounding good programs, and what happened, but how it played out on Winthrop and Kenmore wasn't always the best. But this was the only new construction that was happening on Winthrop and Kenmore at that time on vacant land. Had a very negative image. As we've said, it was part of uptown, crime, transiency, slum landlords, fires, arson. There's a lot of debate about, everybody says arson for profit. I don't know if there's arson for profit meaning you had the slum landlords didn't have anything else to do with their building, so they burned it to collect the insurance proceeds. I don't know how much arson for profit, but according to newspaper articles I've found, there were more than 100 fires in 1 year in 1979 on Winthrop and Kenmore. I mean, so this was a big deal that the community was falling apart. It was called, various parts of the negative image was referred to as the corridor, arson alley. I saw one place call it an urban psychiatric ghetto, all of which was part of this negative image. And when I say part of uptown, I mean, my apologies to uptown, but that every time in the general press when there was a crime on the north side, it was identified as being in uptown. You know, it was in uptown, uptown, uptown. And it was a good thing for Edgewater to simply be Edgewater. It was a fresh image that nobody had any idea what Edgewater is. It was not embedded in the public consciousness. And it was very difficult at that time to obtain, within all this, financing for acquisition and rehab. I don't know how many of you were around then. It's kind of incredible. We talk about inflation now. The prime rate hit 18.45% in 1981. And you know, it's kind of hard to imagine how you can do anything at those kind of interest rates. There's some newspaper coverage. That's a fire on Winthrop. There's another one. This building left behind, and I think that's on Kenmore. So those were conditions along Winthrop and Kenmore in 1980. Some of the positives wasn't all bad. Edgewater, a fresh, as I said, community area number 77. There was actually a lot of new rehabbers coming to Edgewater trying to do things. They're kind of moving up the lakefront. They'd been in Lincoln Park, Lakeview, Uptown to some degree, and we're in Edgewater. Commitment of Loyola, Bob mentioned that, extremely important. Loyola saw this, their southern flank. It was important to their future. They were a supporter of Operation Winthrop Kenmore, and both with money and with respect to personnel and being directly involved, and with development of their own. We had the positives of our north side lakefront location with good transportation and transit access, and a very activist community, the Edgewater Community Council. Most actions went through there. So our redevelopment strategy, first what we did, we developed with this study an information clearinghouse. It was a database of all buildings, ownership, management, and the building conditions along Winthrop and Kenmore. Winthrop and Kenmore, it was and it is today 95% rental housing. So community organizing, when you want to organize in the community, it meant primarily working with the owners. The tenancy was studio, one bedroom, highly transient tenancy, but the owners controlled the nature of the neighborhood, the 95% rental housing. And our purpose was to encourage the owners to invest in the properties, screen tenants carefully, and manage for the long term. And here's what I want to say, that virtually all owners coming in, every owner, let's assume they're a private market owner, they buy a building, they invest in it, they want to profit off the building. That's a given. But the question is, how are they going to profit? And I think that I realize that every owner has an attitude in their mind. They have an attitude toward their building and toward the neighborhood and toward their tenants. And in a solid neighborhood, you want owners that are going to invest for the long term. You want them to invest in their building, manage it well, run good, fair building conditions for the people who live there and pay the rent. And they make their money off of that by managing a long-term good property, and eventually it appreciates, and they also may be making money from cash flow in the long term. That's if you have a good attitude towards your neighborhood. If you think the neighborhood I'm involved in is a slum, and everybody, it's going to hell, and you manage for the short term. You do not manage for the long term. And what you do is you do the opposite. You let anybody in the building who will pay some rent. You're not screening carefully. You're not managing and maintaining the property. You're deferring your maintenance and your payments. And the thing is just going down. It's a recipe for destruction, but that's what was going on. And so our effort was to encourage the owners, to have the owners talking to each other, to say, he's investing in his buildings. He's going to be careful about who he rents to. He's going to be investing and managing for the long term, and you have to do it too. Are you going to be on that team, or are you going to be on the destruction and slum landlord team? So we encouraged owners to invest for the long term, and we aggressively pursued legal actions against slum landlords. There's state law that allows businesses and residents within 1,200 feet to intervene in housing court. And to bring lawsuits against slum landlords, we aggressively did that. And we would identify a slum landlord, or, slum landlord's a big name, but a cliche maybe. But we'd identify somebody in a bad building, and we'd say, you're either going to shape up, and if you're not going to shape up, you'll see us in court. We're going to see, and we would go after them, and we'd prosecute very, very aggressively. And eventually we would go for vacating the buildings. And that would sound like, that sounds bad, and that you're displacing people and so forth. So what I want to emphasize is that these buildings were going down anyway. The buildings are going down. There was no path to success in the future they were going. And you needed to do this because by vacating the buildings, that was the one thing you had, the club, that would destroy the economic value of the building. And if you could destroy the economic value of the building, you could actually come in with new owners that were, as on the back end, who would come in and take over the properties and run them in a productive fashion. We'd be taking investors on tours to match them with their with redevelopment opportunities. And we helped owners obtain financing for acquisition and rehab of buildings. Bob mentioned Community Investment Corporation, where later, 20 years later, I ended up working. But Community Investment Corporation, by the way, it was very hard to obtain financing on Winthrop and Kenmore because of the conditions. And so we went, this Community Investment Corporation was a not-for-profit banker, essentially, that was motivated the banks by the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a federal act which requires banks to provide financial services to their communities. At any rate, they formed, with them, they formed a pool of money that was specifically available for Winthrop and Kenmore. And I went up and down the street in Winthrop and Kenmore and helped package loans to get to CIC. So there was money available. So we weren't just threatening these owners. We were providing a financing alternative for them as well. So that was very important. The branding and image building, we've referred to Community Area 77. We emphasize the positive aspects, the lakefront, transportation, affordability, community organization and activity. We certainly didn't emphasize arson or the corridor, uptown crime. And this kind of image of the community, it affects the landlords, it affects anybody who wants to do business there, it affects people who want to move there, renters or perhaps buyers. All of that is affected by the image of the community. So we had continual public relations, public speaking, press coverage, advertising, promotional materials targeted to both owners and residents. We would do things like, at the time, I don't know what it is today, but the Reader was the place. The way people got tenants for their building, the best place to advertise was the Reader. And we would have giant half-page advertising in the Reader that was come live in Edgewater, and it would be jointly sponsored by a variety of the landlords who were moving in the right direction. As we've said, we had a moratorium on institutional uses. We coordinated a private security patrol. We actually, where there were volunteers who came in on weekend nights and drove up and down through the area and to spot crime and call it into the police. It was a radio patrol, we called it. And we facilitated the conversion of vacant lots to off-street parking and various landscaped areas. I've talked about community action in general, but it was complementary. This wasn't isolated, the housing on Winthrop and Kenmore. We ended up forming the East Edgewater Chamber of Commerce, the Edgewater Development Corporation, and a special service area, all to serve the commercial districts. Parks and Recreation, Harry Osterman's mother, Kathy Osterman, was our recreation chairman at the time, and very instrumental in leading us on the Broadway Armory, the conversion of that to a Park District facility, as well as the Burger Park, which had been called the Viatorian Mansions. It was owned by a Viatorian order of priests, and that was, again, potential high-rise development on the lakefront, but that became Burger Park, and a program called Lake Watch, which was dedicated to keeping the beaches and lakes clean. We had a very strong education committee, led by a woman named Lynn Pierce, who worked with all of the public schools in the area, and we developed design standards for the community through, we had an Edgewater Beautiful Committee, all complementary activity. The common corridor buildings, when I say strategy, I said this was a focus. What was the strategy for common corridor buildings that I said were obsolete, antiquated, no demand for them? Those were the places where the fires were generally. Those were where the demolitions were. That was where the abandonment was. What were we going, and they had been used as these institutional uses. What were we going to do with them? So there were a lot of thoughts. I mean, some people tear them all down. That's one thought. There were a lot being torn down by themselves. Some people said make lofts out of them. Let's get rid of these little studio apartments, break down the walls, make them into loft space. Try to see if you get 1 or 2 units per floor. And maybe it's like a industrial adaptive reuse type thing. It could be used for senior housing. That's a possibility. Making bigger units. One of the things is that family housing. Let's get some more, less of the studio and 1 bedroom, more families in here. People, they aren't here today, but you may know Bob and Ray Ann Surley. When they came into the area, we showed them a common quarter building in the 5700 block of Winthrop and encouraged them to make bigger units. Well, they made 2-bedroom units out of it. And I will tell you, that wasn't a good idea. It was, it was really tough. It was really expensive. They had a whole lot of trouble marketing the buildings, finding any demand for it, and really struggled and basically thought we gave them bad advice, but they, they were in the community for the long term. They ended up doing well over the long term. One guy, Jack O'Callahan, who some of you may know, he converted his common quarter building on the 6100 block of Winthrop to an artist building, artist in residence, and he had an arts background. They said demolition, low-cost studio apartments. What to do with these buildings was a big problem, big question. So it turns out that the most successful approach to the common quarter buildings was a moderate rehab, doing a common area beautification of the exterior, the lobby, the hallways, the elevators, modest rehab kind of inside the units, kind of a patch and paint type thing, making sure the basic mechanics of the building were operating all right and were kept in good condition, affordable rents, and a live-in maintenance management team. I list all of this because that was the formula of a fellow named Camille Halim. It had a company called, his company's called Wilmette Real Estate. It was very interesting. He came into the area and we gave him our advice about making the units bigger and lofts and so on. He said, yeah. And he did whatever he wanted to do. But he said, actually, it's funny, he was a Coptic Christian from Egypt who was a refugee from Egypt. And he had been trained as an engineer in Egypt. So he knew how things worked, how mechanical systems worked together. And when his Coptic Christian sect had come to the United States, Church of the Atonement at Ardmore and Kenmore gave them a place to worship in the basement there. So when we took Halim on a tour of Winthrop and Kenmore, originally he had seen some of our articles in the paper and he wanted to see if there was a vacant building across from Church of the Atonement, 5746 North Kenmore, common quarter building. Well, he was convinced that this was God. This was a symbol. God was talking to him because the Church of the Atonement had given him that place of worship, that he owed this back now, and that's what he said, that he took this building, and that was when he did his first building on Winthrop and Kenmore. And he embarked on this process, which was make the outside beautiful, landscape beautiful, beautiful lobby, really nice hallways, elevators, make them really nice, and do modest improvements inside the units. Charge affordable rents. He was charging at the time like $225 for, this was in the mid-'80s, I'd say, $225 for a studio apartment. And he would have a husband and wife management team that would be both management and janitors services for the building. And that worked. And he did this, and he did this up and down through Winthrop and Kenmore. He probably did 10 different buildings. He was the king of the common quarter buildings on Winthrop and Kenmore. So, and I'd say to this day, that's how most of these buildings got rehab, simply moving that, keep the units affordable, make them look good, do modest improvements, and have your on-site management. Bob mentioned the Pines. This was an interesting story. When I got there, Pines of Edgewater, my number, I don't know what his number was, I got 500 units in 18 buildings over 2 phases of development, about half senior and half family. Was from 1979 to 82. This was federally subsidized both for the development cost and for the rents, the long-term rents of these buildings. So being subsidized with the rental, of course, when I got there, the first phase had already been done, say about half of that, I think there were 240 units in the first phase. Were we going to support the second phase? Was this too much subsidized housing? This was, as I said, it was about half senior and half family. So would this spur much needed redevelopment, or is it going to permanently concentrate low-income housing and discourage market activity? Those were the questions. So we supported the development with these conditions. Now, by the way, this was federal money coming in, both, as I said, for the development and for long-term rental assistance. They had to target vacant properties and other buildings that were in the worst condition. We used government subsidies, because there was more than a normal amount of money available, to creatively redevelop buildings that had antiquated or obsolete designs. Implemented a marketing plan to attract a racially diverse tenant population. Developer implementation of ongoing private security patrol covering the buildings and the surrounding neighborhood, and developer commitment to ongoing community oversight. So that was the Pines, and this is the kind of buildings they did, largely concentrated south of Bryn Mawr on Winthrop and Kenmore. They did both, you see a corridor building and a courtyard building. This was interesting. I wanted to put this one up here because here was an example of one at 5518 North Winthrop. This was a common corridor building that used to, just like every other corridor building, it was vacant. But there were 3 vacant lots to the south of it. And they were able, with the money that they had, to change the orientation of the unit so that they ended up making the corridor ended up being on the north end of the building, and the units faced south. So as you can see here, the units faced south and overlooked this area that was then a parking garage and a landscaped area. This was like 2 or 3 vacant lots to the south of it. So they were able to take all of that, the 2 or 3 vacant lots, plus reorient the building, and this whole building ended up being for senior housing. So by the mid-1990s, I was gone at this time, but people carried on. All vacant lots, you won't find a vacant lot on Winthrop and Kenmore at this point now. All vacant lots, all buildings were redeveloped and put into productive use. There had been more than $50 million of rehab. Edgewater is known as an attractive, affordable lakefront community on the north side. Loyola, I haven't mentioned them, their importance. They redeveloped the area between Devon and Granville as the South Campus area. And on Winthrop and Kenmore now, I think they provide a wide variety of housing opportunities, predominantly very affordably priced and occupied by racially and economically diverse population. Overall community development, now this is in the 1990s, we had improving commercial districts and we had new recreation facilities at the Broadway Armory Park and Berger Park. And here's just some examples. This was a vacant building in the 5300 block of Kenmore. This is across the street. This had been new construction. Now this is private market new construction across the street on Kenmore, 5300 block. This is some townhouses, new construction on vacant lot that was at Berwyn and Kenmore, I believe. This was probably passed by this many times. This was a cut-up 6-flat with 29 units in it. It's been rehabbed, I think, as a 12-unit building. The common corridor buildings were rehabbed. Some more. These were all, everything I'm showing you was vacant at the time, to start with. This is an example of a reuse of a vacant lot up by the Sovereign, which is at southeast corner of Granville and Kenmore. And this happened too, it had nothing to do with what I was doing, but it was a complementary activity, the Viatorian property at Berger Park there. It's Loyola's investment in the South Campus. I had thought at the time, I said, what part of our redevelopment is everything down to Granville on the south end of Loyola should be regarded as its South Campus. And they have implemented that, I mean, as a recommendation, and both as, they've done that with their own planning. So they dominate that end, and some of it has been completely redeveloped. That's the 6300 block of Winthrop, I think, or Kenmore. So some things I want to say about private and public development. So I have emphasized that everything we did, the basis of everything we did, was maximizing the potential of private market forces and trying to talk to owners about operating for their long-term and not their short-term gain. All along, though, it's interesting, there's complementary and selective government financing and support. And I think that's been important. It's not an either-or. It's how can you blend these things together. Community development block grant money, this is general federal money, but it provided operating support for Operation Winthrop Kenmore, some staff support, as well as for the Chamber of Commerce, for the Development Corporation. Community Investment Corporation that I mentioned ended up being a primary source of financing on Winthrop and Kenmore. Well, they didn't, though it was a good organization, but the banks participating in there were largely motivated by, or somewhat motivated, we'd say, by the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. This was a way for them to meet their CRA obligations. And the Pines of Edgewater received significant federal assistance that allowed us to do good developments of the properties and do unique things, but implement creative designs, but also, because of the rental assistance there, implement long-term affordability. Another form of government financing, this is just a funny story. It's interesting how things connect to each other. In 1986, we supported a TIF district creation at Berwyn and Broadway for the commercial district. It used to be an old Treasure Island that was empty and at the southeast corner of Berwyn and Broadway. So we supported the redevelopment of that, and that was a big community issue. So the funny thing is, I'll show some pictures. That, if you ever go by that day, that commercial district is nothing like we wanted it to be. I mean, it needs to be redeveloped now by somebody. But we supported this in 1986, and but the funds generated by this district, turns out, the district didn't become the commercial development didn't develop the way we wanted it to, but it did develop a pot of funds, and in this TIF district, it ends up being used, the money from that TIF district ended up being the source of funds, or a source of funds, to help finance the 379 units at the Bryn Mawr and Bellshore hotels. And this was, I mean, these were massive, this was $33 million in themselves. And I had always wondered, I don't know how we're going to do these buildings, because they're so big and will cost so much. And it turns out it was a multi-layered financing that I don't know, had 10 or 15 layers of financing from the city, the state, the developer was able to get historic district on Bryn Mawr, and because of that, use federal historic tax credits. There were city, state, and federal funds, et cetera. But a lot of this money came from the TIF district that was in 1986 on Berwyn and Broadway. This is the thing on Berwyn and Broadway that I'm not happy about it, but that was, it is what it is, and I think it needs to be redeveloped today. It's not good. I think the TIF district is long gone too. But this is Bryn Mawr Apartments in the Bellshore Hotel. They were done with financing from there, and so it did end up contributing to that. We had an interesting thing too there was to pair this kind of development, this housing development, with an effort at commercial development. One of the big efforts in the community at that point was, can we improve the storefronts on Bryn Mawr at this time? And I know we've backslid there too. I mean, this is like, this was good development at the time. It was good to use the housing funds. Oftentimes you find their money is available for housing, and can you use it to also help your commercial district as well? And because you can't really, these are not very high rent places for commercial spaces. At any rate, I don't know, I saw that Starbucks is closing down. I don't know if is the First Midwest Bank there still? I don't know if that changed names, but it's still something's there. Okay. But I know that commercial, the Francesca's.
Closing because they got a union.
Well, yeah, I get it.
No, it's also the crime problem.
Yeah, well, whatever. Francesca's is closed. The Nookie's is closed on that street.
The building ownership changed and it's slum landlords. That's the problem.
The low income footprint is way too heavy, which is why the retail
Can't make it.
And
Why
Sheridan.
don't we let Jack finish?
All right, we'll finish.
his presentation and we'll go to questions.
So where do we stand today? So I say highly diverse, dense, largely affordable, predominantly rental neighborhood. There's no empty boarded up buildings or vacant land. Most buildings are in good condition, but I've seen as I drive around, there are some signs of deferred maintenance. I think it's because of the concentration of lower income people and it's potentially vulnerable, very vulnerable to economic and social changes. And I think particularly you could see challenges on the commercial strips. And I think there's a need for ongoing vigilance and community organization to combat these things. And that's it. Well, that's nice. Thank you. Well, that's nice. I recognize some people I didn't, as I was making my presentation. Paul Boyd is there. Hi, Paul. Paul is the guy that made me, when he became president of Edgewater Community Council, he made me the executive director. He said, I want to be president, but I want you to be the executive director. So thank you, Paul, for that. Denise DeBell worked hand in hand with me on the staff. And I would also say, I think I have noticed that there's several aldermanic candidates here. Now we have this interesting time when we have a wide open aldermanic race. And I want to thank the aldermanic candidates for coming here to hear this background and at least get this perspective on the neighborhood and add, put it in your brain and think about what you would do with this.
We welcome comments and participation from everyone in the audience. No stump speeches.
No. Oh, yes, but I'd like to just recognize the aldermen who are aldermanic candidates who are here are.
Hi, I'm Nick Ward.
Nick
all.
Ward. Somebody else back there?
Hi, I'm Lenny Mana Hoppingworth.
Lenny.
Lenny Mana Hoppingworth.
Hi there. Hello.
Joe Dunn.
Joe Dunn. Anybody else?
I'm not a Democratic candidate, but I just wanted to point out something. Which Dave, you sort of touched on, but I think it needs to be emphasized. Part of the reason that ECC was able to have, there are many reasons, many factors, but part of the reason is because we always had the local political support. And there's a lot of communities that can't say that.
Yeah.
So that is something I think to be aware of.
And it was a big move, yeah, right. But let's just leave that as it is. So I encourage all of you folks, and thanks for coming. And but let's have a discussion then, right?
So Jack, I think that this presentation needs to be presented in the high school and civics classes. And seriously, people don't know this. And look at the age of hardly money here.
High school.
Whichever alderman wins, I hope that your staff is required to see this. Did you film it or something?
Yeah, we did.
And I mean, seriously, people do not understand what transpired. I moved here in '86, but this is also the field I worked with you. So, this is a really extraordinary story, unlike any other community organizations where it was always just fight, right? Most of the other community organizations in Chicago at the time were all about just fighting the enemy and not coming up with positive solutions. So I really want to give all of you credit.
I would echo that comment, and I would say I've been a reporter and a community activist in Chicago for 30, 40 years, and I used to write about urban affairs for the Reader and various outlets like that, and I really would say this is an absolutely unique undertaking and accomplishment in the city of Chicago. There's a lot of stuff like this that goes on now. I think a lot of it was inspired by what happened here 40 years ago. I don't know that any of it took on the scope of the issue that we had 50 years ago and had the tremendous success like we had here in Edgewater, which I think is really one of the main distinguishing features of this community right now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to, very commendable what happened in the 70s, 80s. I think it needs serious tweaking now. I think the footprint of the pines is way too heavy. And last I checked, which was a dozen years ago, they had 22 buildings.
What did I say, 18?
Yeah. And
You know what? You know, at the 20, they could, well, whatever, you might have been counting the vacant lots too, maybe.
Well, it's interesting, because I talked to HUD not that long ago, and they initially said 8 buildings, and then I said no.
No, that was just because there was in 2 phases, like a phase 1 and a phase 2.
But they're not.
At any rate.
They're not as well aware of things. So in my experience living in the neighborhood, we are really wholly dependent on the quality of the management, which has been iffy at the Pines various times, as has been their commitment to maintenance and repair. And when the footprint is as large as it is, you feel it if you live in the hood. The other thing I'll mention is not only do we have the footprint of the Pines, but other rental properties are also now taking voucher housing. So we have a growing lower class population. That makes it very difficult for retailers when you've got people with $1 million properties west of Broadway and you've got the huge footprint of lower income. Why is Francesca's gone? In part because any restaurateur will tell you they need summer activity, but summer people didn't want to eat outside because people in the SROs are coming over panhandling continuously while trying to have a relaxing dinner. So those populations have a difficult time.
I know. And you know, the other thing I would say, and I don't want to discount anything you said, I think it's all true. I think that we also had the pandemic, when you talk about the restaurants, we had the pandemic and Francesca's again on Bryn Mawr, a lot of disruption, I think, with the L construction. And you don't think so?
No, because I live on, people probably know Mrs. Pori. When I moved in, people know Mrs. Pori. Okay. So I live right around the corner, and I don't think it's the L is keeping people away.
No, I mean, I thought there's been disruption from construction activity.
I
You don't think so? Okay.
And I live right on top of it. The crane fell on the building.
All right, well, how about, would you give me the pandemic, though? The pandemic? I think restaurants are hurry.
I think it's the pandemic. Times are tough, but I don't think it's...
Because there's no question on Bryn Mawr, but you see it on Broadway, too, that you see we were like kind of stretching out with some commercial development there. There were new restaurants that were going in. There were some nice new stores, a bakery, things like this that had gone in. And they've, in the last 5 years, all backslid, maybe 3 years. But at any rate, yeah, go ahead.
I love the presentation of urban renewal in the sense of a focus on housing, rebuilding housing.
Yes.
But urban renewal probably is a larger umbrella, including elements of safety
Yes.
and elements of economic opportunity.
Yes.
You brushed on both of those very briefly. You mentioned a private security, and then you mentioned shared funds from the TIF
Yes.
that
Yes, yes,
help
yes.
the
Yes.
urban areas. So could you elucidate a little bit more on those two
Well,
pillars? Or was
I don't
that
know.
just
Okay,
outside
well,
the
so-
scope of the project that you were...
Oh, is outside, but it's related. Let's talk about safety. You know, the safety, I think, on Winthrop and Kenmore, a lot of it had to do with managers taking responsibility for their buildings and who they were renting to and what kind of controls they set up, what kind of rules they set up for their renters and so forth. To not think that my responsibility ends at my front door and I have nothing to do with all the people hanging out in front, for instance, that are drinking out in front of my building, for instance. But there's good, strong tenant screening, I would say, to start with, and responsibility from owners. I will tell you an interesting thing is also, and I don't know where we stand in the city today with the police, and there's so much issue about the police being targeted to the hardest hit, the biggest crime areas of the city, and I don't know to what degree that has cost an area like ours. You think it's moved a lot? Okay, well, so let's say that. The other thing is, what I would say is, and this is a bit controversial, but I will tell you, we were proponents and supporters of something called the broken windows theory in the 1980s. And nowadays, they say the predominant train of thought is the broken windows theory is racist, discriminatory and so forth. But I will tell you, and the broken windows theory is this, that you can't have broken windows, you can't have graffiti, you can't have all signs of social disorder, because social disorder provides an environment for bad things to happen, for bad things to flourish. They think that's what happens in this area. I will tell you, this is an interesting thing. When I lived on the 5600 block of Kenmore, and there would be a problem out in front of our building or on the side of the building, the police would eventually come, if you would call them, and the first thing they would say is, "Why are you living here?" That's what they'd say to me. And I'd say, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" He says, "This doesn't belong, this is not your area. This is something else. This is some other, it's the crazy, the low income, disorganized, socially crime type of area." And say, no, we live here. And so, but I will tell you, there implicitly, whether people state it or not, everybody, just like I said, landlords have a perspective on a neighborhood, on how they make their money and how the best way to operate is. Everybody, the police have this, and they think, what is the social standards? What's socially acceptable in this neighborhood? And they would, so a funny thing we did, I organized at one point in response to this, a petition drive called East Edgewater United. And it said things like, well, we don't like graffiti, we don't like people hanging out on the streets, we don't like prostitution, we don't like public drinking, we don't, saying all this signs of social disorder, we don't like all that stuff. And it was interesting because I was attacked, and we were attacked by being, well, this is racist. This is, what do you think? This is a racist cover for your anti-black people. I said, you're out of your mind. And because, as it turns out, this was the most popular thing we had ever done in terms of reaching out to, including like the African American community. People who loved this petition would be African American mothers, would be who were confronted with this kind of garbage every time they went out there. So the police were panicked by this because we were attacking the police in a sense, saying, okay, we'll help you. Well, this is the standards for this community here, and you're hearing us all say this. So as a long way answer, I don't have an answer for armed robberies or something like this or something, but I think it's, but this is the kind of thing, you have to set a social standard and you have to adhere to it. And I don't know. The second thing I would say on commercial development, I'll let other people talk. The one thing you could do a lot of times in a building like, I mentioned the TIF districts, you can subsidize new developments to come in, new users. And we did that to some degree, and particularly when you looked at the Bryn Mawr and Bellshore apartment hotel, the money's not really coming from the commercial to support the building, isn't coming from the commercial there, it's coming from all the residences in there. So as a result, you can pretty much, you can be not really target the commercial spaces for high rent, but for enhancement in the community, try to get users that improve the quality of the area and the building. What I would say, however, is that another thing I found in commercial development, you can give away everything in commercial development. You can build something for somebody, you can build it out for them, but nobody, a commercial user is not going to come there if they think they're going to lose money every day they're there. Because the capital costs up front pale in comparison to the everyday operating costs. And so that has to do with, you got to be viable. And I go back to when I worked for the city, when Rahm Emanuel was able to get the Whole Foods to locate in Englewood, and I shook my head and I thought, this is, okay, go for it, but it's like, when you reach out and you do something like that, and if the Whole Foods really wasn't viable there, and it wasn't, everybody knew that from day one they were losing money, that eventually when it closes, is it worse than having not been there at all? But I don't know, I do think, the final thing I'll say on commercial development is ongoing frustration for me has always been our whole community, I think, is underserved commercially, with exception of maybe Andersonville on Clark Street. That's vital and vibrant and so forth. That's very good. I'm not exactly sure why compared to everything else. But when you try to get,
That's a whole other story.
All righty, when you try to get users in they'll go to a suburban location that has less population, and we have more buying power. You could demonstrate in our area, and they won't go here. I think it's, in a way, it's a formula that they're afraid of crime and stuff in the city. But anyway, those are some thoughts. Yeah, Blue. Nice.
Hi,
Hi there.
Lenny.
Hi, Lenny.
I wanted to pitch, if you're not a member of the Edgewater Historical Society, please join today, because this was fantastic, and I would like to give you a round of applause for that. I wanted to share that I am a lifelong dancer, and I went to New York. I had a scholarship at a dance school that was in Times Square, the Ailey School, but they didn't give me housing. So I lived in an SRO there. I lived in 2 SROs, and I could tell you that it does matter who is managing that building, because one of the SROs is now like a boutique hotel, and the other SRO, I don't know what happened to it. But I was able to live in New York City because I lived in an SRO. So the other thing is that I'm a business owner, a small business owner in Andersonville, part of the Chamber of Commerce, and I have been talking to other small business owners across the ward. And I do believe that, my point is, I do believe that this conversation can galvanize many, many things. My question to you is, at the time that you were doing all this, you didn't have social media. So how did you do it?
Community organizing.
We just, I don't know, use conventional communications, right? We did. We had lots of in-person meetings. We had volunteers out. When we surveyed I remember we surveyed every building in the area. I just asked for volunteers from the neighborhood, and they all came. And on Saturday mornings, I was organizing the surveys. But in terms of communication, I think it was primarily through the press, through the Lerner newspapers.
We've lost a lot of that over the years.
Block clubs, there were block clubs. So personal communication through the block clubs. There were block club meetings, all kinds of organizations. One of the block clubs, community organization, we can all say that we need more of that today, and I think we do need a rebuilding of that. An interesting problem, an interesting challenge is, what exactly is the problem you're facing? If there's a giant, nothing unites like a big common enemy or problem. And I think to some degree, these community organizations and block clubs have dissipated because there's not such an identifiable big problem. And the what?
Because
things got better. And so I think that's hard, because what are you doing? And what are you doing in these? What's the agenda? It's hard to keep a positive, targeted agenda. Mike?
In the back.
This was terrific. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Tell me, were there any instances you can remember when you were collecting the data, or you just referred to volunteers with the surveys? I'm wondering, there had to have been some landlords that did not want you around because they were making a good buck and what have you. Did you have trouble at any instance? Or
Not on the surveys themselves, but we had many a landlord who would tell us to take a hike, and we'd. I tell you, there was a guy, a typical. I don't know. It comes up in my mind because there were these guys categorized as slum landlords. They were almost more easy to deal with, in a sense. They were bad guys. They didn't want to talk to anybody, and they knew we were going to go after them. There was a guy named Mitchell Max, another guy named Saul Azar, we were Lou Wolf. Lou Wolf actually didn't have, he had properties on Broadway, I think, but not on Winthrop and Kenmore.
We had a lot in Uptown.
In Uptown. So, but those were just out-and-out bad guys. But I remember there was a guy named Emil Shanazi who had the building at 6101 North Winthrop. It was at, I guess that's Glen Lake Winthrop northeast corner. So this is what he wanted to. Everybody thought this was, he didn't, but wait. He had this building that was pretty nice, and let me say, what did it have in it? Let's call it 1 and 2 bedroom units that were luxurious for this corner building. They had a sun porch, a living room, a dining room, and they were 1 and 2 bedroom units. They thought people, in the name of developing large family housing, he got hooked in with some moderate rehab program at the city of Chicago. So by doing a very minimal amount of rehab, he could make bedrooms out of the sun porch and the dining room, and so you added this, so these 1 and 2 bedroom units became 3 and 4 bedroom units, and I think maybe even the living room. And what I remembered was you only had one common area left. Oh good, now instead of 1 and 2 bedroom that were luxurious, I would say, you had 3 and 4 bedrooms where you had everybody jammed in, and you had one kitchen where that was it. So and I remember talking to him and saying, you don't get it. We're not doing this. We'll be for family housing, but it's got to be in a proper context, and we're not taking these kind of units and then all of a sudden cramming everybody in. That's great. So, at any rate, he was a city employee, though. We stopped him.
We're going near an hour and a half. I have to leave in about 5 minutes for a funeral, but I would encourage the conversation to continue as long as Jack's willing to be here. I also just wanted to say this presentation is actually, I should have said this at the get-go, is part of our annual Bud Wyman lecture series. Bud was, I don't know if any members of his family are around, but he was very instrumental in the turnaround of Edgewater back in the day. He started a very important community bank of Edgewater. He's no longer with us, but he endowed this annual lecture series specifically focused on kind of these urban type issues. So all that is background to say I would like to continue this conversation through future programs. Jack and I have already talked about some of these ideas. So typically we would do the Wyman lecture in the fall, but there's, I think, some impetus to try to do something even sooner than a year from now. So I would also say the Edgewater Historical Society, thank you for the pledge to join. We were an outgrowth of the Edgewater Community Council, and ironically we're the one kind of formal organization that remains today. So we've got a few other hands.
I'll go on if you don't mind.
Well,
I'd just like to say the Edgewater Community Council ought to be refounded. Memory, you could do that. And I just got an idea. As we get older, we don't become retired, we become the Edgewaters.
It's so much more fun that way.
Maybe we ought to allocate some of our inheritance, or I'm not going to go into detail, but I bought a building in 1985 at 5241 Winthrop with my wife, and we still own it. And it was a slum, and it was the only building that wasn't rehab. Everything else was boarded up. And as a vice president of the Edgewater Community Council, I said, if I better put my money where my mouth is. I love this building, and it's still modest income. It's gone from 13 units to 6, and then a 7th unit. It's a center entry 6 flat. They make $2,400 a day, which $2,400 a month. They were $600 a month then. And I'm thinking, and there's a Q11 building across the street that my tenants had no idea that they're surrounded by Section 8 infused housing with assistance from the federal government. And they just think it's a wonderful neighborhood, and I'm thinking, if you only knew what this was. And I tell them stories. But my point is, I think this is a success story, and I think my anecdotal review of the whole neighborhood, it is still a low, modest income to middle income, and every economic class has thrived in this, the rich to the poorest. And we're all still here, and almost all the housing is occupied, period. That is a success story in housing policy and social governance. So.
I just want to say to both of you, thank you so much for doing this. And so I love Edgewater, and I've only lived here for about 4 years. I lived in the Gold Coast for about 45 years. And when I came here, what I said to myself was, this is the kingdom. Everybody lives in Edgewater, every nationality, I think there's like over 200 languages spoken. And interestingly enough, a person from my church, a minister, who ended up in, for a while helping out at Andre Martha Presbyterian Church, she said to me, she didn't know that I lived here because I always lived downtown, right? And I was at the mosque here, and I've always done interfaith work, and she spoke at the mosque, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" and the thing is, she said the same thing when I saw her, and we went to lunch, and she said, "This is the kingdom." This is very special. Everything that you have done. In my original, I grew up on the west side, and I lived there during the riots with Martin Luther King and the whole thing. So I have all different perspectives, and you all have these here already. And I don't know how, all I can say is it's people of heart, and I think that we, Edgewater, can be the model for, as they're building up the west side again and the south side. And by the way, I volunteered in Edgewater for a long time before the Whole Foods was built, and I didn't think it would ever get built. Is it closed now?
No, which one, Englewood, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
60 Garden Hall said it closed. That's very sad. So I think that this is a model that can get stronger, and people coming together, the community working together. And I think, and I don't mean this in a conceited way, Edgewater's got it. They understand. The people don't understand it. And the other ones are just looking for money.
I heard about the broken windows theory years ago.
Yes.
And I like the name, but I disagree with the way it's explained. Yes, the broken windows have to be fixed, but I disagree with the context explanation. I think the focus has to be, after we fix the broken windows, to fix the law breaking that causes the broken windows. If you don't enforce the laws and take care of the people who are breaking the laws, the person who breaks the window one day might in the future do something even worse, or maybe not. But it's about the individuals who break the windows, not the context in which it happens. People who are not inclined to break windows are not going to break windows just because they see a lot of broken windows. I'll tell you a story from Saskatchewan decades ago. I was, look at that.
You're about to be.
Anyway, I was visiting a mutual friend who is, outside of a small town that you probably never heard of. And one day we went into town to buy something, and I was very surprised that he didn't lock his car. And he told me that nobody locks their cars there in that town. Well, I don't think anyone leaves gold bricks on the passenger seat. But the reason nobody had a lock of the cars that I know inside now is because people just didn't go into someone else's car.
Maybe we'll do a future program on the history of public safety. Thank you for that contribution. And I'm going to have to get running in a minute or two. But,
This person over here next to
if I
Denise
could
says,
also just say, if people can help break down the room and stack the chairs, that would be a tremendous
all right.
asset for the library.
What were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much, and also that we still do have problems to solve.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we need another survey in multi-age group of what's going on in our neighborhood. Because now a lot of millennials and consumers are facing high rents in new places, and some of these people are starting families, and it's an issue for them. And, you know, I mean, also housing ownership, and the corner of Broadway in Boston, we have a new red line modernization going in, and I don't know if anybody's realized it's going to allow unload trucks through like Foster Avenue. Yeah, because of the clearance is higher.
Oh, really?
John, if you want to get going, we can.
So we don't.
A possible future program, just walking out, is all of the dependent populations in the slum wards and became a petri dish for a history of massive vote fraud and corruption in Edgewater. I think that might make a good topic.
About Edgewater crime from curb to ballot box.
Because, for
Good
example,
headline.
so one building, our former ward committeeman went to jail for 8 years because he extorted, when the community was trying to get these buildings rehabbed, he was extorting $5,000 per unit that was being converted and fixed up as a bribe to get the permits downtown. And he and another alderman, not from here, went to jail for 8 years. That's what the community was fighting. All those dependent populations were their votes were being manipulated. There was massive vote fraud in the nursing homes. People from Edgewater, Mary Ann Smith, Gene Hyder, a lot of other, Kathy Osterman, got the law changed with the help of State Attorney Rich Daley to change all the nursing home voting laws so these people could not be manipulated in a criminal way. So this is another example of stuff that came out. We didn't really get into it today, but that whole political transformation was massive. When I started thinking about all these buildings and all these people, they were all being manipulated. Their votes were being stolen. I mean, it's another story.
Yeah.
It's another
I'm going to
story.
make one last plug for the program on the Edgewater Beach Hotel on December 6th.